cold, biting wind swept across the courtyard of the Great September, stirring the crimson cloaks of the men who stood guard at the entrance. The streets of King's Landing lay quieter than usual under a sorrowful morning sky, as if the city knew that change was coming. Gray clouds overhead churned slowly, pregnant with the promise of rain, and the few people brave or desperate, enough to be out, walked with their heads down and their voices hushed. Something ancient hung in the air, a heaviness of dread and reverence both. The faith militant had called for a gathering inside the Great September, and rumors flew through the capital that a revelation of momentous import would soon be revealed. Yet none could have guessed how far the faith was prepared to go. Inside the sept, hundreds of devotees, sparrows, and septons had assembled. Torches spat and flickered against the thick stone walls, their soft glow falling across the array of men in plain robes or simple armor. At the center, the High Sparrow, though many had started calling him differently these days, only ever half loud, as if naming him outright might call his attention, stood before the towering altars of the seven. Time had left its mark on him. New lines grooved his sunken cheeks, and his eyes glittered with fervor that none could mistake for anything but true, unyielding belief. He raised his hands slowly, and the gathered faith militant fell silent, the only sounds the crackling of torches and the faint echo of their own breathing. Behind the High Sparrow stood a figure shrouded in a simple white cloak. Even from the back, one could see he was tall, broad-shouldered, a knight's figure perhaps. Yet he wore no finery, no house sigil, and carried a humble sword at his belt. Whispers had circulated that this man had done the unthinkable, laid down his noble name, taken vows of chastity and devotion, and pledged himself wholly to the seven, but not as a mere sparrow or a mere warrior's son. There was talk that the High Sparrow would anoint him as something more, much more. Those gathered did not need to wait long. The High Sparrow's voice, reedy with age yet amplified by the perfect acoustics of the great chamber, rang out in solemn reverence. He spoke of the history of the faith militant, of how once they had been the armed hand of the seven, how they had risen in ancient times to overthrow wickedness in high places. He reminded them of the horrors inflicted by kings and lords who had forgotten the commandments of the gods. He recounted centuries of greed and sin that had befallen the realm as the nobility waged wars of vanity. Then, with a passion that ignited every soul present, he promised a new dawn, a dawn in which the true authority of the seven would reign, not the petty ambitions of mortal men. In that moment, he beckoned the tall figure forward. Gasps rose as the man stepped into the torchlight. His face was not that of a youth. Lines of weariness and resolve marked him. A couple of men near the front recognized him. Mern Mullendor, once a knight in service to House Tyrell. He had pledged the sword of his house to the faith militant after the atrocities he had witnessed in the Reach, or so the tale went. Yet rumor had it he had shed his old name and only answered now to a new one, a holy one. The High Sparrow anointed him with the oils of the seven, sliding a gentle hand across his brow, the fluid gleaming in the torchlight. His voice quivered with righteous excitement. He declared that the realm had wandered astray for too long, that the lords had grown arrogant and unworthy, that the Targaryens had brought dragons and madness, that the Baratheons had shattered the realm with war, and that the Lannisters had bathed it in gold-tinged treachery. The Tyrells, the Martells, the Boltons, the Freys, every house had become complicit in the realm's sorrow. And so, by the authority granted him by the High Septon's seat and by the will of the seven themselves, he named this night the chosen king, who would rule not by mortal inheritance but by the blessing of the gods. A hush fell over the crowd, broken only by the strangled shock of a few who realized what these words implied. The High Sparrow was crowning a new king, one who owed allegiance not to bloodlines, but to the faith alone. He lifted a simple crown of plated steel, dotted with 7 small crystals, each representing one facet of the divine: father, mother, warrior, maiden, smith, crone, and stranger. This was no glimmering gold circlet, no shining symbol of a house. This was a crown that spoke of humility, of unwavering faith. With trembling hands, he placed it upon the head of the kneeling knight. In a voice that carried across the sept, echoing in every ear, the high sparrow proclaimed, "Before the eyes of the seven, who watch us all, I give you Baylor of the faith, Baylor, the chosen king, to shepherd the faithful and smite the wicked, that the will of the seven be done." The newly anointed Baylor slowly stood. A hush spread through the congregation, for in his face they saw not the uncertainty of a man thrust unexpectedly into power, but a cold, unwavering conviction. He looked across the gathering, and in his eyes burned a righteous fire that stirred hearts and churned stomachs alike. Then he unsheathed his sword and drove its tip into the stone floor at his feet, where it clanged and sparked. He raised his voice, resonant and fierce. "By my blade, I swear to bring justice. By my heart, I swear to uphold the laws of the seven. And by my faith, I swear to root out heresy and end the tyranny of the so-called great lords who have ignored the will of the gods. Let any who stand against us tremble, for in the name of the seven, we shall conquer." Cheers erupted from those in the sept, raw and filled with fervor. Some had tears streaming down their cheeks. Many raised fists or swords to the ceiling. A new era was upon them, and the faithful believed that finally, at last, they would see a realm guided by righteousness instead of treachery and greed. Yet in that resounding cheer, there also lay a ripple of fear, for where the faith militant marched, blood often followed. That same morning, word spread through King's Landing with the speed of lightning. Taverns were abuzz with talk of this new chosen king. Some mocked it as madness, certain the crown would crush the faith militant in short order. Others held their tongues and remembered the chaos of the last wars, the ease with which armies can tear the small folk apart. And still others whispered that perhaps the faith truly had the right of it this time. Had not the lords of Westeros again and again proven themselves unworthy of their lofty status? By midday, the Red Keep's lords and ladies had begun to gather in the throne room, alarmed by news of the faith's bold step. The reigning monarch, an uncertain boy named Jaehaerys Waters, rumored to be a bastard nephew of a Targaryen offshoot, sat uncomfortably upon the Iron Throne. He was not crowned under usual traditions, but installed after a messy attempt at stabilizing the realm once the previously warring claimants had died off. His rule was tenuous at best, with only a fraction of the houses willing to bow. Now, faced with the faith's direct challenge, even that fraction threatened to splinter. The Boy King's small council was in disarray, each member clamoring for a response. Some demanded that the crown arrest the High Sparrow immediately, others advocated negotiation. Still more muttered about raising the gold cloaks or rallying the noble houses to quell this rebellion. A handful glanced around, perhaps remembering that the gold cloaks were already riddled with men who favored the faith. A statue of the seven in gold might have been the only thing missing to remind them how thoroughly the new movement had seated itself in King's Landing. Jaehaerys Waters, hardly more than 16, clutched the arms of the throne. He swallowed hard and tried to keep his voice from trembling when he finally spoke. "We cannot simply allow them to crown their own king. The throne is mine. My claim is recognized." He stumbled over the words recognized, as though he too understood his was a paper-thin authority. "We must summon the lords loyal to me and put an end to this heresy." It was a bold statement for a boy so young, yet a hush fell, for all in that throne room remembered the monstrous battles of the recent past. The small council exchanged uncertain glances, while Lord Ormond Derry, master of laws, raised a single, quivering hand. "Your Grace, the faith is not a band of outlaws. They have powerful sympathizers, commoners, knights, even some lords who may be devout enough to switch loyalties. We must tread carefully. A direct confrontation could ignite all of Westeros in a holy war." The Boy King's cheeks reddened, either with frustration or fear, perhaps both. "What would you have me do then? Kneel to a septon who crowns a Sellsword?" He spat the words, though the scorn in his tone seemed a mask for the anxiety shining in his eyes. A council member coughed to fill the uneasy silence. "We must gather our allies, yes, but we must also ensure the faith does not turn the small folk wholly against us. If they see us as enemies of the gods, it could end poorly." The debate dragged on for hours, but no clear course emerged. By dusk, Ravens were being sent to all corners of the realm, imploring houses large and small to reaffirm their loyalty to the Iron Throne and to stand against the faith's usurpation. The crown might have been wise enough not to refer to Baylor as a traitor in its letters. He was labeled a misguided rebel. Yet no one missed the underlying tone of desperation. A war was coming, and alliances needed to be secured. Meanwhile, the chosen King Baylor, though he humbly insisted he was but a servant of the Seven's will, gathered his new court in the Great September. The High Sparrow, the devout Septons, and the leaders of the faith militant formed the bedrock of his inner circle. They set about the practical matters, raising an army, organizing supply lines, ensuring that the small folk in King's Landing would side with them instead of the boy king. With each passing hour, more devout men trickled in. They came from the streets and alleyways of Flea Bottom, from the outskirts of the city, from neighboring villages. They came with clubs, pitchforks, swords, old armor, or no armor at all. The faith took them in, for the Seven commanded them to be open to all who were true. That evening, a strong-limbed youth named Robard approached the chosen king with a mixture of awe and defiance in his face. "Your Grace, or my lord," he began, stumbling over the correct title for a king who professed no worldly lineage. "I come from a distant hamlet in the Crownlands. The sept there has been torn down by men who claim loyalty to the Lannisters. Will you help us rebuild it?" Baylor studied the youth calmly. "We will rebuild all that has been shattered, for that is the will of the Mother, who nurtures all. But first, we must purge the wickedness that allows such destruction to go unanswered." He reached out and gently clasped Robard's shoulder. "Will you stand with the Seven against the tyranny of these lords?" Robard's eyes blazed with sudden fervor. I will. I have seen the cruelty of lords. My father was hanged for failing to pay taxes that he could never afford. If the Seven can save us from such cruelty, I will do whatever needs doing." Baylor smiled, the lines of his face softening for a moment. "Then go, young one. Prepare yourself. The battles to come will test you, but hold fast to your faith, and the Seven will guide your sword. We fight not for bloodlust, but for justice. Be sure your heart remains pure." The next morning, the faith militant made their first move. A contingent of armed sparrows marched through the streets, urging small folk to renounce any ties to the nobility and to pledge fealty to Baylor, the chosen king. There was no immediate bloodshed, merely an imposing display of piety mixed with stern authority. But the message was clear. The faith was finished bowing to worldly kings. They would now stand as an equal force, governed by what they believed was higher law. Within days, those who had once only whispered about the faith's power began seeing it for themselves. Ration wagons bearing the symbol of the Seven rolled through poorer districts, distributing bread and thin stew to the hungry. Woodcutters hired by the faith repaired ramshackle houses. Septon after septon preached in the streets about a new dawn. It was, to many, a small mercy after years of conflict and hunger. Even if they felt uncertain about pledging themselves to a new king, they could not deny the immediate relief brought by the faith's presence. But fear also crept into corners of the city. Gold cloaks loyal to the crown found themselves challenged in the streets by armed sparrows who would demand they remove the lion-headed insignias or the golden stags, and replace them with the seven-pointed star. Some complied out of fear for their lives. Others refused and were beaten until they complied or lay broken. A hush fell over the city. The small folk watched from windows and doorways, uncertain whether to cheer or cower. The tension began to unravel explosively when a minor lord named Crispin Celtigar marched a small band of his men into King's Landing. He had business with the crown, or so he claimed. Crispin was no friend to the faith, muttering repeatedly that these rag-wearing peasants play at piety while crowning themselves kings. When some of the faith militants stopped Crispin's retinue outside a local sept, Crispin spat at the ground and cursed them openly. That single moment ignited a brawl. Crispin's men were quickly overwhelmed. He was dragged from his horse, battered and carried, bruised and bloody, before Baylor in the Great September. The court of the chosen king was in session, a strange mixture of solemn devotion and an undercurrent of raw militant force. Crispin Celtigar was forced to kneel on the cold marble floor. Baelor watched from a short dais. The High Sparrow stood at his side, silent but watchful. Crispin tried to maintain his pride, though blood trickled from a cut in his scalp. "You have no right, no authority to treat me thus. I am a lord, and my house is sworn to the crown." In answer, Baelor's voice was calm yet had that edge of steel that was becoming famous. "We are all equal in the sight of the Seven, Crispin Celtigar. Or do you believe your name places you above judgment? The Father weighs the hearts of all men, from the mightiest lord to the most wretched beggar. Your arrogance marks you as a sinner." Crispin's face contorted. "You dare speak to me of sin? You who have usurped the rightful rule of Westeros?" An uncomfortable quiet followed. The sparrows who stood guard shuffled on their feet, each seeming to tense as if anticipating an order to strike Crispin down. Baelor let the words hang in the air. His gaze flicked to the High Sparrow, who gave the barest of nods. "Our rightful rule is that which the Seven themselves ordain," Baelor said. "You speak of birthright and claim, but for centuries, men of noble birth have crushed the innocent under their pursuit of power. The lords wage war, break bread, wage war again, while the small folk starve. This city is rife with orphans left by your lord's ambitions. Where were the kings when that happened? Perhaps enthroned in their high seats, counting gold." Crispin opened his mouth to retort, but Baelor cut him off. "But the Seven see all. Now the scales must be balanced. You call me a usurper? My claim is that which was bestowed by the voice of the High Sparrow, who but echoes the Seven themselves. If you scorn that, you scorn the gods. Yet I offer you a chance to repent and swear yourself to the faith. Do so, and you may yet keep your life." By now Crispin trembled, realizing that his situation was dire. The memory of how swiftly his men had been subdued bore heavily on him. "And if I refuse?" Baelor's eyes hardened. "Then you shall be left to the stranger's judgment. Your life forfeit." For a moment, Crispin seemed ready to defy them. A proud streak shone in his eyes. Yet pride is cold comfort in the face of a vengeful crowd. The crowd was not only the sparrows and septons, but also King's Landing folk who had shuffled into the sept to witness the spectacle. Many glared at the lord with unmasked resentment, remembering lords in general for their taxes, their forced levies, their casual cruelty. Crispin glimpsed the hatred in their faces. Fear contorted his features. He swallowed hard, then bowed his head. "I will renounce. I lay my sword at the feet of the Seven. He grimaced, pain and fury in his face. "I accept you, Baelor, as chosen king. So the gods judge me if I lie." Murmurs ran through the September. A wave of satisfaction washed over some, while others simply looked on in shock. Baelor let the moment linger, then nodded. "You are wise to humble yourself," he said. "But words are hollow if not followed by deeds. You will lead your men back to your lands, Lord Crispin, and you will build new septs, feed the poor, and show by example that you have truly repented. Should you fail, the faith shall be watching." With a gesture, Baelor ordered Crispin's release. The battered lord was pulled to his feet. He shot Baelor a seething look that only half hid his humiliation. But he said nothing more. 2 sparrows escorted him away. That same day, Crispin Celtigar left King's Landing, nursing bruises of both body and pride, his men scowling behind him. But he was alive, and that was more than many had expected. The news of Crispin Celtigar's humiliation spread quickly, sending tremors through the noble houses. If even a proud scion of a long line was forced to bend the knee to this new faith-appointed king, who was safe? Lord Giles Rosby, hardly known for his courage, decided to send a discreet envoy to the High Sparrow, offering gold and a promise to convert all of Rosby's household guard into dedicated faith militant if only they would leave Rosby's domain untouched. Another lesser lord did the same, and soon the crown realized that the faith had begun to pull not just the small folk to its side, but also lords who valued survival above loyalty. The letters that the crown had sent across the realm arrived in castle after castle, but they were met with varying reactions. Houses once loyal to House Targaryen in spirit, like the Valerians or Macys, found themselves at odds with the faith's new monarchy, for it threatened to overshadow all traditional claims. Yet they could not deny the power the faith wielded. Meanwhile, in the Reach, House Hightower found itself in a precarious position. The Hightowers boasted the greatest sept in Westeros within Old Town and had always been close to the faith. In times past, the faith militant had thrived under Hightower auspices. But to challenge all the nobility outright? That was another thing entirely. The head of House Hightower, Lord Leighton's grandson, Ormond Hightower, rumored to be well-versed in prophecy and lore, had to choose carefully how to navigate this crisis. In the north, the Starks had always been somewhat distant from the faith of the Seven, worshipping the old gods. They had historically allowed septs to be built for Southerners in their domain, but the old ways remained strong in Winterfell. Now they watched the developments with a mixture of curiosity and foreboding. If the faith militant declared war on all nobility, would the Starks be next? Or would their different gods grant them a reprieve from this holy crusade? Either way, the Lord Stark, Brandon, son of an earlier Brandon, was not inclined to let southern zealotry spill onto his lands without due caution. Similarly, the Iron Islands had no interest in the Seven. The drowned god was their sole deity, and the notion of a faith-led monarchy likely struck them as laughable. But the Ironborn also had a history of raiding and reaving when chaos gripped the mainland. This new war might offer them fresh opportunities to plunder the coasts if the realm turned inward on itself. Thus, a tinderbox was formed across Westeros. The chosen king, Baelor, and the High Sparrow carried the flame of their faith to every corner, stoked by men who saw in them justice or vengeance or both. The Boy King in King's Landing scrambled to reinforce his shaky hold, forming alliances with houses that still recognized the Iron Throne. Clouds of war massed on the horizon. The first real battle did not take place in King's Landing, but rather in the Riverlands. There, Lord Harroway, a minor bannerman to House Tully, had for years used brutal tactics to enforce his rule over the local peasants. When he received the crown's plea to stand against the faith, he quickly mustered what forces he could, 60 men-at-arms, plus a handful of knights. He marched to meet a small faith militant group that was preaching in nearby villages, forcibly removing any local septons who refused to acknowledge Baelor's kingship. Lord Harroway's men cornered the faith militant in a hamlet near a muddy riverbank. Swords were drawn, and a savage skirmish followed. It was the faith militant's first real test of steel outside the capital. Though the militant group was outnumbered, they fought with wild devotion, chanting the seven-pointed stars verses between fierce sword blows. Some were untrained small folk, but others were seasoned former knights who had joined the faith. Harroway's men quickly realized that raw zeal can be a formidable weapon. In the end, blood soaked the mud of the riverbank. Harroway's men had the advantage in discipline, but the faith militant fought with near-suicidal fervor. When a rider galloped off to summon reinforcements from a nearby Tully outpost, the faith militant commander, a scarred knight known only as Ser Giles the Penitent, shouted for his men to hold formation. It was not a conventional tactic, more a grim determination to hold ground until help could come from other cells of the faith that were rumored to be near the Trident. Luck, or something more, favored them. Another band of devoted warriors arrived just as Lord Harroway's men were about to break their lines. Trapped between the two faith militant groups, Harroway's men faltered. Lord Harroway himself fought fiercely, taking down several sparrows before a spear thrust caught him in the chest. He fell to his knees, coughing blood. Ser Giles stood over him, breathing hard. "The Father awaits you," he said, voice raw with fatigue and pity. "May you find repentance in the next life." Harroway died on the spot. The faith militants suffered heavy casualties too, but they had won. News of this victory spread through the Riverlands like wildfire, sowing alarm among lords still uncertain of which side to join. Here was proof that the faith would not break easily, even against well-armed men. Over the next few weeks, more skirmishes erupted in pockets across the Crownlands and the Riverlands. Sporadic battles, not large-scale engagements. The faith militant, always flexible and mobile, found ways to strike swiftly and then rally supporters in each region. The Crown's forces struggled to coordinate a united front, in part because the Boy King's command did not inspire the devotion or fear that previous monarchs had wielded. In King's Landing, tension mounted daily. The Red Keep was a fortress, but outside its walls, the Great September of Baylor stood as another fortress of faith. Thousands of sparrows patrolled the streets, while the gold cloaks found themselves unable or unwilling to confront them in large numbers, fearing riots or betrayals from within their own ranks. The city was effectively divided. The Crown controlled the Red Keep, a small perimeter around it, and a few loyal districts. The Faith Militant controlled the Great September, the poorest neighborhoods, and the hearts of many. At any moment, it seemed, a single spark could set off the powder keg. Inside the Red Keep, King Jaehaerys Waters paced restlessly. He was a boy forced to wear a man's crown, grappling with problems that would have tested even the greatest rulers. His small council had been reduced to a handful of loyalists after multiple members either vanished or were found dead in the night, signs that the streets were no longer safe for them. Whispers abounded that the Faith Militant was responsible, but none could prove it outright. One late evening, his master of whisperers, a shifty man of Bravosi origin named Rivaro, slipped into the royal solar with fresh tidings of doom. "Your Grace, the Faith Militant is planning a grand march through the city on the morrow. They say the chosen king himself may appear, riding a donkey as a symbol of humility. The small folk adore him, or at least they are enthralled." Jaehaerys stiffened. "They are mocking me, parading through my city as though I do not exist." He turned to Ormondari, his master of laws who still lingered. "We must respond. We cannot allow them to overshadow our authority." Derry looked torn. "If we confront them head-on, we risk bloodshed. The city is near to exploding already. Better to fight than to roll over and die," snapped Jaehaerys, though one could see the fear behind his eyes. "I will not yield the throne to this peasant king." Rivaro gave a knowing bow. "As your grace commands. But be warned, the faith's numbers swell with each passing day." In the gloom of the Red Keep that night, the Crown's loyalists hatched a plan. A show of force, they reasoned, might stem the faith's momentum. The Boy King ordered the gold cloaks to block the main thoroughfare leading from the Great September to the crowded marketplace, effectively preventing any large demonstration. Additionally, archers would be stationed on rooftops to dissuade any attempt to force through. The idea was to avoid outright massacre, but to display enough intimidation that the Faith Militant would think twice about continuing. At dawn, the Faith Militant gathered as promised. Thousands of small folk turned out to watch or to join. Prayers and chants filled the air. Leading them was Baylor, the chosen king, not astride a grand destrier but walking alongside a donkey laden with bread loaves to distribute among the needy. The donkey bore a simple wooden sign inscribed with the seven-pointed star, and the lumps of bread bouncing in sacks on either flank. Behind Baylor came a procession of warriors, septons, and common folk. Some waved flags marked with the seven-pointed star, others carried relics of the saints. They moved through the winding streets, singing hymns, while the city seemed to hold its breath. The gold cloaks were there as planned, forming a wide barrier. Archers watched from the rooftops, their bows strung, though few small folk noticed them, focused as they were on the spectacle below. Baylor halted a few yards from the gold cloaks, raising a hand for silence. His followers stilled, their singing subsiding into a hush that blanketed the street. Dust motes danced in the early morning sun, shining through the cracks in the city's old walls. In front of him stood the captain of the gold cloaks, a tall man with a thick beard and a nervous twitch in his left eye. He attempted a stern face, but the closeness of the throng rattled him. "By command of King Jaehaerys Waters, rightful ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, you are to disperse," he proclaimed. "No further assembly will be allowed. Turn back at once." A ripple went through the crowd behind Baylor. Some of them tensed, expecting confrontation. Others whispered prayers. Baylor himself did not break eye contact with the captain. His gaze was strangely gentle. "Do you see these people, Captain? They are the realm, its sons and daughters, the faithful children of the Seven. They gather in peace, not to wage war. We bear bread, not swords. Will you deny them their right to worship? To feed their hungry? The captain's brow furrowed. He glanced at the donkey, the sacks of bread, and the lines of ragged men, women, and children. He also saw the armed faith militant, no doubt, though their weapons were sheathed at the moment. The hush in the crowd felt like standing under thunderclouds. He licked his lips and spoke again, less certain. "Turn back. I will not tell you again." Baylor stepped forward. His expression remained soft, but his voice carried. "Captain, you are sworn to protect the city's people. Are these not your people? Will you truly block them from receiving mercy and grace?" A mutter rose among the faithful. Some pressed forward. The gold cloaks responded by lowering spears. Men flinched, but Baylor held out an arm, signaling for the crowd behind him to hold. He moved closer to the captain, so close that the spear tip nearly touched his chest. He said, "I do not come to shed blood today, but if you turn these people away, you force conflict. If your king is righteous, if he cares for his subjects, he should allow the hungry to be fed." The captain wrestled with his orders. He felt the pressure of so many eyes, the tension of archers above, the fear that a single misstep could plunge them all into chaos. Yet to defy the crown's direct command would make him a traitor. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Slowly, he took in the donkey, the kneeling and praying small folk, Baylor's unwavering stance. He saw no madness, only devotion, albeit with a threatening edge. Seconds passed in painful uncertainty. Then the captain lowered his spear, motioning for the gold cloaks to step aside. Some of them hesitated, but none dared disobey him outright. The crowd let out a collective sigh of relief, and a wave of admiration swept Baylor's followers. Baylor offered the captain a solemn nod. "May the seven watch over you, brother." They continued their procession, distributing bread and preaching of a new era. High in the Red Keep, the boy king watched from a balcony, fury and dread mixing in his young face. His attempt to show strength had failed. In a single, symbolic moment, the faith militant had demonstrated that the crown's power was not absolute in the city. J. Harries slammed his fist against the stone ledge. Behind him, his small council looked on in silence, as powerless as their king. In the days that followed, tension only grew. The crown's inability to act decisively emboldened the faith. With growing confidence, Baylor issued proclamations from the Great September, calling upon all lords to either pledge fealty or prepare for the righteous cleansing. He insisted that true rulers serve their people first and foremost, not their own ambitions. Many small folk cheered, tired of aristocratic abuses, but others feared what a single theocratic king might do once unopposed. As the faith's influence expanded, the High Sparrow advised Baylor to strike a decisive blow in the crownlands, to secure them entirely before focusing on the outer regions. Baylor concurred that a demonstration of strength might quell lingering doubts. So he led a modest army of faith militant, some 2,000 strong, into the countryside, where local lords still wavered on whom to support. Along the Rosby Road, they encountered a group of knights loyal to House Blunt, who had decided to remain true to the Iron Throne. Conflict erupted swiftly. The knights, well-armed and disciplined, had expected an easy victory over a rabble of fanatic peasants. But they found themselves outnumbered. While many of the faith militants still wore rags and mismatched armor, their unwavering devotion made them formidable, and more than a few were experienced fighters who had seen battle in recent wars. Battle cries filled the air. Steel clashed on steel, and the dusty road ran with blood. Through the chaos, Baylor moved like a man possessed. He was no mere zealot with blind passion. He had been a knight in his previous life, a disciplined warrior. Some watchers claimed that in the thick of battle, his eyes glowed with the holy fire of the Seven, though more practical minds might say it was the reflection of the sun on polished steel. Regardless, he fought with an unmatched ferocity, cutting down night after night. Where the faith militants saw him, they rallied, chanting his name and the names of the Seven. In an hour, the House Blunt Knights were either dead or in retreat. Their leader, Sir Benfry Blunt, knelt in the dirt, an arm clutched over a grievous wound. Baylor loomed over him, sword dripping red. Ser Benfry glared up defiantly. "You spit on your vows," he gasped. "You break the realm's peace. You claim holiness but bring only war." Baylor paused. For a moment, conflict flickered in his eyes, as though the man he once was questioned the blood on his hands. But the next instant, that shadow was gone, replaced by a steadfast conviction. "We bring the only war that matters," he said quietly. "A war to cast out sin and injustice. Peace built on wickedness is no peace at all." With that, he offered a final prayer for the man's soul and ended Ser Benfry's life with a swift strike. The surviving faith militant gave a ragged cheer, while Baylor stood motionless, seemingly lost in prayer. Those who watched him said that tears mingled with the blood on his cheeks. Word of Baylor's victory traveled fast. Lords who had been on the fence now faced a stark choice. Side with the crown, which was losing prestige by the day, or bow to the new faith king whose armies fought with fanatical bravery. Some remained loyal to tradition, hoping a coalition of great lords would soon rally. Others, especially those who had neither large armies nor strong alliances, quietly began sending letters or emissaries pledging fealty to the faith. Back in King's Landing, the boy King Jaehaerys Waters could only watch as more of his domain slipped through his fingers. The Red Keep became a fortress of fear. Some lords from the council left under cover of night, hoping to rally allies in their distant homelands. Some never returned. The Gold Cloaks, seeing how the wind was blowing, abandoned their posts in increasing numbers to join the faith or simply disappear. One day, Jaehaerys walked into the throne room and found it almost deserted. Only a handful of loyalists standing about, faces grim. The rest had forsaken him. 3 weeks after Baylor's victory on the Rosby Road, a new rumor circulated that House Tyrell in the Reach was mulling an alliance with the faith, presumably to avoid the fate that had befallen House Blunt. If that happened, the crown's cause would be all but doomed, for the Reach commanded vast armies and resources. It was also rumored that several devout ladies of the Tyrell household sympathized strongly with the High Sparrow's message, especially given the chaos that had plagued the realm in recent years. Sitting in his solar, the boy king stared at a map of Westeros. The Reach was marked by a green swath, and the Crownlands by a small ring around King's Landing. If the Tyrells threw their support behind the faith, the crown would be encircled. He slammed a fist on the table. "We must do something," he said, voice trembling with the frustration of his impotence. Lord Ormond Derry, looking thinner than ever, nodded. "A decisive stroke, Your Grace. If the faith will not bow, then we must strike at its head. Capture or slay the High Sparrow and Baylor, cut off the serpent's head, and the body will wither." Jaehaerys stared at him. Kill them inside the Great September? The notion horrified him on some level. Killing a High Septon in a holy place was sacrilege. But the realm was crumbling under his watch. Would that not ensure the small folks' hatred forever? Derry spread his hands. Desperate times demand desperate measures. We can blame it on some arrangement. The realm must be saved from this madness. With an unsteady breath, the young king nodded. "See it done. Quietly, if possible. I will not have an open massacre in the streets." He swallowed, realizing how far he had fallen from any sense of moral high ground. But the alternative was to watch the throne slip away entirely. The plan that took shape was crude. A group of assassins, disguised as pilgrims, would slip into the Great September during morning prayers. They would attempt to kill Baylor and the High Sparrow. If successful, a second group of gold cloaks, stationed nearby, would storm the sept to provide cover for the assassins' escape. In theory, the faith militant would be in disarray, giving Jaehaerys an opportunity to reassert control. It was a plan born of desperation, with many flaws, but the king's counselors could think of no better solution. Dawn broke on the appointed day, pale and gray. The Great September was packed with worshippers. The faith's rise had revitalized religious fervor. The assassins, about half a dozen, filtered in among the masses. They wore simple robes, carried no visible weapons aside from hidden daggers. They joined in the chanting, stepping closer and closer to the raised platform where the High Sparrow led the congregation. Baylor stood a step behind him, head bowed. No one seemed to notice the 6 men gliding through the crowd, their faces bowed in feigned reverence. Or so they believed. But the High Sparrow, old and frail though he might appear, had not survived so long without caution. And Baylor, who had once been a knight of the realm, was no fool. They had posted watchers among the faithful, discreetly scanning for suspicious faces. The watchers spotted the conspirators moving in a tight formation, gradually encircling the High Sparrow. Wordlessly, signals were passed, and armed sparrows converged. It all happened in a heartbeat. The assassins lunged forward, daggers flashing. One of them managed to cut the High Sparrow's arm before a faithful guard slammed a club into his skull, dropping him where he stood. Another leapt at Baylor, slashing a shallow cut across the new king's chest. Baylor stumbled, pain and shock flaring in his eyes, but he recovered swiftly, smashing the attacker's jaw with a gauntlet fist. The entire sept erupted into chaos. Shrieks, shouts, the clang of weapons on stone. Those who had come merely to pray cowered or fled in terror as the faith militant seized or slew the would-be killers. Outside, the gold cloaks waited for the signal that would never come. Instead, they heard a tumult of screams from within. The September guards tried to rush inside, but the doors were quickly barred. They pounded uselessly on the heavy timbers while inside, the faith militant overwhelmed the attackers. Blood spattered across the marble floor, staining the mosaic of the 7-pointed star as the last assassin was cut down. When the doors finally opened, it was to reveal a grim sight. Corpses of assassins lay strewn about, and the High Sparrow nursed a bleeding arm. Baylor had a nasty slash across his chest, but it appeared superficial. Fear and fury radiated from every devout face. The crowd roared in condemnation. The gold cloaks, stunned by the carnage, took one step forward and froze as dozens of sparrows pressed in. Weapons bristled, and madness threatened. Through the commotion, Baylor raised a hand. His voice thundered, loud and clear. "This is the justice of your so-called king, Jaehaerys Waters? He sends murderers to desecrate the Great September, to slay the chosen of the 7 in the very house of the gods." His words echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "Is there any among you who still doubts the sea? Roan's corruption." Cries of condemnation rose from the faithful. Some spat at the gold cloaks. The captain in charge of them tried to speak, tried to protest that this was not how it was supposed to go, but he was shouted down by 100 voices. Faced with an angry mob, the gold cloaks turned and fled, leaving the sept in the hands of the faith militant. Thus, the attempt on Baylor's life had backfired spectacularly. Instead of weakening the faith, it galvanized them. This brazen attack convinced many fence-sitters among the populace that the crown was indeed a force of evil, willing to murder in the god's own house. As word spread throughout King's Landing and beyond, outrage soared. More and more turned against the boy king, while Baylor and the High Sparrow were cast as holy victims of an unholy monarchy. Within days, uprisings began in the streets around the Red Keep. Armed mobs gathered at night, chanting curses upon Jaehaerys. Windows were smashed, shops looted, soldiers ambushed. The crown scrambled to maintain control, but loyal forces were too few. Panic and paranoia ran rampant through the keep's halls. Some courtiers argued for a last-ditch sally forth to crush the faith militant by force, but it was a doomed notion. The faith's numbers in the city alone dwarfed what the king could muster. Finally, with the city teetering on the brink, King Jaehaerys Waters faced the unthinkable: flight. His small council was in ruins, and the Red Keep was nearly surrounded. Every day, more small folk and even petty lords joined the faith. The sea offered the only possible escape route. One moonless night, Jaehaerys and a handful of followers slipped out through a secret passage. They made their way to the docks, where they bribed the captain of a Lycene trade ship to carry them away from King's Landing. Just after midnight, the boy king stared back at the city walls fading in the distance, uncertain whether he felt relief or shame. He left behind a throne that he had never truly possessed, an empty monument that had cost him more than he could bear. The next morning, a wave of confusion rippled through the Red Keep when guards found the king's chambers empty, the royal bed unslept in. By noon, it was clear. King Jaehaerys Waters had abandoned his seat. The gold cloaks who remained promptly surrendered or melted away. The faith militant marched in, unopposed. The Red Keep fell without a drop of blood. The gates were thrown open, and Baelor, accompanied by the High Sparrow and a host of devout warriors, entered the fortress with a slow, methodical step. Onlookers watched from balconies and windows. Some cheered, others stared in silent dread. Baelor paused in the great hall, gazing up at the vast, cavernous space that had witnessed so many coronations, trials, and intrigues. At the far end stood the Iron Throne, forged of 1,000 swords, a monstrous seat of kings. A hush settled among the faith militant. The High Sparrow studied Baelor, uncertain what the chosen king would do. Baelor approached the throne, footsteps echoing. He stopped just short of its razor edges. For a moment, he simply stood, lost in thought. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he removed the steel and crystal crown from his head, the simple crown of the faith. Silence grew thick and charged. The watchers wondered if he would place his crown upon the Iron Throne, or perhaps seat himself in it as countless conquerors had before. But Baelor did something none expected. He walked past the throne to the raised platform behind it, where a tall candelabrum stood. He placed his crown on the platform, letting its crystals catch the flickering light. Then he turned back to face the wide-eyed onlookers. "This throne," he said, voice echoing in the silent hall, "has been a symbol of mortal pride and ambition for centuries. Each sword in its iron form represents a conquered foe, a violent act that elevated one king over another. Men have died, kingdoms have burned, and countless innocents have suffered so that rulers might claim this twisted seat." His gaze swept the hall. But now the seven rule, not a bloodline, not a mortal's pride. The throne of men has no power here. With those words, he knelt upon the cold floor, head bowed, and recited a prayer to the seven. The faithful around him dropped to their knees as well, a wave of reverent devotion. An eerie hush hung in the air, broken only by the crackle of torches and the soft murmur of fervent prayer. When Baelor rose, he raised his hands. "Spread the word to every corner of this city," he commanded. "King's Landing is free from the yoke of worldly kings. Henceforth it shall be governed by the Seven's laws, by the wisdom of the High Septon and those who walk in the light of the gods. The seat of power is no longer this abomination of twisted steel, but the Great September, the true heart of faith." Cheers erupted from the gathered faith militant. A new order was declared in the city that day, as the chosen king formalized the separation from all previous royal traditions. No more kneeling to the Iron Throne, no more Iron Throne at all. Over the following days, zealots hammered away at the fused swords, pulling shards of metal free, until the once fearsome throne stood cracked and half-ruined. Some called it sacrilege, others liberation. Regardless, the symbol of the old monarchy was destroyed. King's Landing changed overnight. The faith quickly established a council of septons, septas, and devout knights to oversee governance. Laws were restructured to reflect strict adherence to the seven-pointed star. Sin was to be punished ruthlessly. Whoring was banned outright, with brothels closed and whores forced into workhouses run by the faith. Gambling dens were burned. Taverns found themselves heavily restricted. Beggars received charity, but also stern sermons on piety. Wealthy lords and merchants were compelled to donate large portions of their gold to feed the poor and repair the city's infrastructure. Some in the city prospered under the new regime, especially those who had suffered under the previous monarchy. Others found it oppressive, especially those whose livelihoods depended on vice or free trade. The city's mood was mixed, but for the moment, the faith's power was unchallenged. They had the hearts of many small folk, and the devout armies of sparrows patrolled every street. Beyond King's Landing, the realm took a collective breath. The Boy King was gone, and a new power reigned in the capital. Some lords, like Crispin Celtigar, swallowed their pride and pledged allegiance to Baelor. Others, threatened by the faith's condemnation of decadent nobility, began fortifying their castles. They feared that Baelor's holy war would not stop at King's Landing. They were right. The High Sparrow had long spoken of purging the entire land of sinful lords. Baelor himself, though more reserved in speech, was no less resolved. The transformation of King's Landing was only the first step. Now that the city and the Red Keep lay under their control, the faith militant turned its gaze outward, to the rest of Westeros. Forces were marshaled, new levies of common folk trained in basic arms, and traveling septons sent forth to rally believers in every region. Within weeks, word reached the Riverlands that a formidable faith militant host was marching north. Lords who had not yet bent the knee prepared for a fight. The Vale, ever cautious, closed its high passes, uncertain whether to commit to the faith's cause or remain neutral. In the Westerlands, the remnants of House Lannister struggled to maintain order, as their once vast wealth offered little protection against a fanatical army. The Reach, largest of the kingdoms and historically friendly to the faith, balanced on a knife's edge, uncertain which side to choose. In Old Town, the Hightowers, the ancestral guardians of the faith's most sacred seat, felt an especially heavy burden. For centuries, the Starry September had crowned kings, but never had the faith crowned a king of its own with the aim of subjugating the entire nobility. Some in House Hightower whispered that this was heresy, that the faith should remain spiritual rather than temporal. Others contended it was destiny, the gods will made manifest. Lord Ormond Hightower vacillated, sending diplomatic letters to Baelor, while also fortifying Old Town's walls and forging alliances with lesser lords. He feared that if the faith pressed for absolute submission, the city might become a battleground once more. Meanwhile, in the north, Brandon Stark convened his bannermen. The old gods were not of the Seven, and the faith's condemnation of all lords who cling to false worship worried him. A small band of northern warriors had already clashed with wandering sparrows near the neck. The details were murky, but it seemed that northern ways had been labeled an affront to the Seven. The Starks bristled at such interference. If the faith came north in force, war would be inevitable. Still, the distance was great, and winter threatened soon. Perhaps the faith would not rush to subdue the entire continent at once. Far away, on the Iron Islands, the Lords Reaver remained uninterested in Baelor's religious zeal. The Seastone chair was still warm from the last king's ascension, and they had no love for the Seven. Even so, opportunistic captains set sail for raids along the coastline, hoping to exploit the realm's upheaval. As the days turned to weeks, the unstoppable advance of the faith militant seemed more certain. Baelor and his generals methodically planned their next campaigns. They had no illusions. The lords of Westeros would not all kneel willingly. Blood would flow. The High Sparrow, seemingly older and more frail each day, spoke often of the necessity of sacrifice. "The path to salvation is never without cost," he would say. "Our hands will be stained, but so long as our hearts are pure, the Seven will guide us." A sense of inevitability hung over the realm. Some hoped the lords would unite and quash the faith's tyranny. Others believed that the Seven's justice was at long last coming to punish centuries of nobility's sins. Most dreaded the horrors that seemed sure to come. For once, the war was not a simple matter of rival houses vying for the crown. This was a war of faith, one in which the enemy was not just a person but the entire institution of nobility that had reigned for centuries. And at the center of it all, Baelor, the chosen king, knelt in prayer each night, asking the Father to grant him wisdom, the warrior to grant him strength, and the mother to grant him mercy. He had not sought power for its own sake, so he told himself. He had answered the call of the Seven, bearing the weight of their will. He knew that many would curse his name, that thousands would suffer or perish. But he believed that, in the end, the realm would be purified, as or is purified in fire. The thought both haunted and steeled him. There in the ruined throne room, Baelor sometimes walked alone, each step echoing in the emptiness where once courtiers thronged. He would stare at the battered iron throne, now a twisted mass of broken steel, and wonder if he was indeed delivering justice or simply unleashing a new brand of tyranny. His nights were troubled, dreams of a flaming sword and a weeping mother, of ravens crying out above battlefields soaked in blood. Still, come morning, he donned his armor and recited the Seven's prayers. There was no turning back. The path of holy war had been chosen. Far beyond the city, the boy King Jaehaerys waters docked in Pentos, stripped of power but still clinging to a tenuous claim. He plotted vengeance in the shadows, forging alliances with exiled lords and sellsword companies. In Dorne, the Martells watched from afar, as they often did, uncertain whether to risk entanglement in yet another southern war. Across the narrow sea, foreign princes and magisters eyed Westeros with curiosity, some seeing an opportunity to meddle, others anticipating trade disruptions. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the Faith's crusade would remake Westeros or leave it in cinders. Yet in the hearts of many small folk, a flicker of hope glowed. The lords had never cared for them as much as the Faith did. At least that was how it appeared. They dreamed that perhaps under this new regime, they might find fairness and protection. They gathered in septs to pray for deliverance, for an end to war and hunger. But some nights, their prayers were drowned out by the clang of distant forges, forging new swords for the holy host. With each day, armies grew, banners of the Seven multiplied, and the anthem of righteous wrath echoed through the land. Thus began a new chapter in Westeros, one none had foreseen. The Faith Militant had crowned their own king, toppling the old monarchy and declaring holy war on the nobility. All across the realm, from the frosty mountains of the Vale to the red deserts of Dorne, men and women trembled or rejoiced at the dawn of this radical new age. And in the cold corners of his conquered keep, the chosen king silently weighed the cost of what must come next. Whether the Faith could truly save the realm, or whether they would only damn it anew, was a question that would be answered by steel, blood, and the uncertain hearts of all who called Westeros home.